Hello, and welcome to Dumaguete IELTS.com. Writing Task 1 Lessons for IELTS. In this video, we are going to look at Task 1 Writing for pie charts. And specifically, we're going to talk about how to group data and write static sentences. Okay, so grouping for static sentences or static graphs. Static graphs include some tables, pie charts, and bar charts. Usually line graphs have time. The others do have time, but sometimes they do not have time. So anything without time is classed as a static graph or pie chart or whatever it's called. Okay, so grouping for data for static charts is slightly different from dynamic data or data charts, in the fact that there is always 100% to be divided up. This never changes. A pie chart consists of 100%. So for static data, the rule of thumb is look at the groups. How many groups are there? How varied is the data? Differences. Is the data all of the same type? Usually it is, but in some graphs you'll find that it's different. So always check it carefully. For static data, we look at the comparisons between each segment, and we follow this rule, or these rules. We look at the largest segment, the smallest segment, segments that are similar, segments that are different, and trends, things that follow a particular trend. So this is the pie chart we're going to use as our example. The pie chart gives information on UAE government spending, United Arab Emirates in the Middle East. In 2000, the total budget was Arab Emirate dollars, sorry, 315 billion Arab Emirate dollars. Okay, so that's what's being measured. It's being measured in money. So looking at the chart, notice the spelling mistake there, but that was in the chart. That was not me. We see that we've got a lot of groups here. More than 10. I think there's 10. Let's just count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We can cover most of this, but we can't talk about each individual segment, because the essay will be far too long and it's not necessary. So what we're going to do is going to follow our rules and break it up and group some data. So we have a single pie chart here. Often there are multiple charts. I will be doing videos or making videos later which show you how to describe or write about multiple charts, multiple maps, etc. So we follow the rule of largest, social security, smallest, transport, similar, defense, other, debt. Sorry, defense, other, and debt, those three there. Then we have similar, housing, law, industry. These are also similar, law, housing, industry. We'll come to the figures in a while. And education, health, different. The reason it's different is because this is on its own as the largest. A lot of these are similar. These things are very similar. This one is the smallest, which we've got here, but this one doesn't fit into any of these. You could say it's different, but at the same time, we don't want to write about everything. So That could be one that we don't write about because there's nothing significant about it. It's not the biggest, it's not the smallest, and it doesn't have any similarities to anything else. So we could, in fact, omit that, but we could also include it as a different. I know this is a little bit confusing, but please remember that not all IELTS essays are going to be the same. 5 people or even 10 people could write with using this information, and all of their essays could be different. And it depends how they group the data. So one thing you must always remember is don't think there is just one way, because that will restrict your way of thinking, and also you'll be worried about not getting it correct. What you've got to do is present the data, follow the instructions, make sure it's presentable and it can be understood. That's what you've got to do. So variation is often the key. So for this, we've got our segment. So what we're going to do is look at how we can group it. So each pie chart is different. So look carefully at the numbers, then decide what to use. When writing sentences about static data, we use the language of comparison, comparing segments. Unlike dynamic charts, there is no time. So there is no start and no finish. We just identify each segment and provide information about it. We're also going to focus more on comparison because that's all we have left. So here's some example sentences going back to what we just looked at. The largest, biggest, main, proportion, amount, expenditure. We have to adjust the grammar depending on what the information is showing us. So here are some expressions that we're going to use. So using these expressions here, I've made a couple of example sentences. The largest expenditure is on Social Security. That means the most money is spent on Social Security. Expenditure is how much money you spend. The biggest proportion of the budget is spent on Social Security. The largest amount of spending is on Social Security. So again, we're using our amounts here and what we're talking about, expenditure, proportion, amount. So they're different ways that we can express ourselves. Right, for this chart, as I said before, there are 10 segments. We have to reduce this to around 3 to 4 maximum. Otherwise, you'll have to write about too many things, which in turn will increase the size of your essay. 150 words is not as many words as you might think. You can write them quite quickly. If you plan well, 150 words is not that many words. Okay, so here we've got a grouping of health and social security. Second, health and personal services. And then similar, defense, other, debt, interest. These three are similar. Law and order, industry and agriculture, housing and heritage. These three are also similar. And transport is the smallest. This has left education, which does not fit into with any other group. So we can reduce this even further by saying social security and health, 3 and 4, number 3, number 4, we can group those together as being similar. And then we can mention transport, which is the smallest. Okay, so the type of sentences we use to group similar items. We could use complex sentences to group similar items together. We can see that defense, other, and debt are grouped. Why? Because they have almost identical numbers. So we can create sentences like the following. Three groups, defence, other, and debt interest, have almost identical figures with 22, 23, and 23 billion respectively. So, going back to our segment, so defence has 22, other has 23, debt interest has 23. There's 1% between those three. So my sentence reflects this, giving the numbers. When we say respectively, it means in this order. This goes with the first one, other goes with the second one, debt interest goes with the last one. That's what respectively means. I'm sure you've practiced that before or been taught this before, but that's for those of you who are not sure or who have never heard this before. So another sentence could be, other, debt interest and defence share a group difference of only 1%, with defence on 22 billion, while debt interest and other show 23 billion. So same information, just a different way of expressing it. So what I'd like you to do is try writing similar sentences for law and order, industry and agriculture, and housing and heritage, which are also similarly grouped. There is a worksheet and instructions at the end of this video. Okay, let's look at some vocabulary to express small items. So we have the smallest, tiniest, least, lowest, depending on what we're talking about. Remember, also countable and uncountable nouns are very relevant in this situation because they govern what kind of vocabulary we use here. And here, actually, proportion, amount, expenditure. Yes, for example, if we're talking about money, we couldn't say the number of. We could put the number of here, the number of people, because people are countable, but we couldn't put the number of money because money is uncountable. We would have to say the proportion of money, amount of money, etc. So be careful with countable and uncountable nouns. In task 1, there will be a lot of uncountable nouns as well, so make sure you're familiar with them. So here are some examples. Transport shows the least expenditure from the overall budget. The smallest proportion of government spending goes on transportation. The lowest amount of money is spent on transportation. Transportation accounts for the tiniest proportion or percentage of the budget. So it says we also have to focus on the language of comparison, which we've already given some examples, but we're going to look at some more. We use comparatives, bigger, smaller, more or less. We also use superlatives, the biggest, the smallest, the most, etc. We can also use expressions of comparison. When we compare, compared to, similar to, different from, the same as, while, whereas, by comparison. All of those are enough for any essay, more than enough to write a single essay. Examples. Social Security was the largest, superlative, sector of expenditure, whereas transportation was the smallest. So we're comparing this with this by using whereas, contrast. Defence, debt, and other expenditure had similar budgets, but these were much more than industry, law, and order. So these three are similar, but they were much higher than these three, which are also similar. The country spent just under twice as much on Social Security as it did on health. So twice as much, comparison, twice as much as. We spend twice as much on one thing as we do on another. Compared to education with 38 billion, defence has a much lower allocation of funds. So funds allocated to defence are much lower than those allocated to education. Okay, so these expressions and the relevant grammar, etc., are needed to present the data accurately and with variety, have to be practiced regularly. Again, I always stress, don't think you can write 1 or 2 essays or even 3 or 4 essays and think that's it, I've practiced enough. You've got to keep writing essays. You should be producing essays all the time. And with each essay, you should be improving to the point where you can write an essay, task 1, we're talking about, to the point where you can write a task 1 essay within 20 minutes easily. That takes a lot of practice. From my experience as a teacher, I see the majority of my students don't practice enough. I sit them in the class or they attend the class and I say, have you got any essays? How many essays have you written since last week? 1. Did you send it to me? No. This is the kind of thing that will not get you the high score that you need. So you've got to be practicing essays all the time. No matter how boring or tedious you think it is, you've got to think of what you're trying to achieve. That's the bottom line. Right, the exercise I talked about earlier, practicing sentences, has some answer suggestions in the link below. What you should do first is practice writing some of those sentences before you review our suggestions. Check that yours are accurate in both grammar and meaning first, and then, if you're not sure, check them against our examples. Okay, so you can click the link below to get to this document. And that's the end of this lesson. Please subscribe to our new channel. It's about a week old now, and I'm slowly populating it with videos. So just if you subscribe to the channel, you will be notified as soon as a new video comes out, which will save you having to check. So please subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.